equipment can be a very interesting topic. So if anybody ever wants to talk about that, we can talk about it on Slack, or we even might have some time today since we are a smaller group to talk about our issues and situations. But first, let's get to the content. Can everybody see and hear me? I could tell, just because you're all looking very fresh and engaged. Thank you for that. 3 lessons again. I like to start with an overview of last week every time because everybody's busy. You're all doing other stuff until you race to your chair or put on your Zoom and wait for me to get my act together. So, so here's an overview. Last week's class, we looked at the big picture. The publishing industry, who's hiring developmental editors of fiction. Very interested to read your evaluation, self-assessments. I just found it I always find it fascinating about how people describe their reading interests and what floats your boat in terms of what you like to read, and then also what you're thinking of working with. And I know that the majority are probably going to work with just indie authors or with a mix of indie and querying authors, which I think is excellent. There's so many of both. It's almost too much, but it's not, because there's going to be more and more editors who are capable of helping people get their books to publishable quality. So then we went into what to expect, which is just a preview of the course. Oh, the deadlines and stuff. And then all about you with some talk about reading sensibility and genres and things like that. This week's class, we're going to meet the writer, actually the project, because I will almost always meet writers either through their projects or through a mutual acquaintance. And when COVID hit, I stopped kind of, going places. So I didn't meet writers in real life before I worked with them, which I hadn't done much anyway. Editing is a remote job most of the time. There are a few writers I've worked with in Vancouver, but I tend to work outside of Canada, as in most of my clients are outside of Canada, which is for a few reasons. One of them is that in-person meetings can suck a lot of energy and bandwidth. So I tend to avoid them. I don't mind Zoom because I can be doing something else right up to the second beforehand. But in person, I'm not built that way. And so although I love talking to writers, I really don't want to change and drive all that stuff. It's always worth it when I do it, but I try not to do it. Then second tonight, I'm gonna sort of unpack the developmental edit as I do it. So if you've been giving critiques to other writers or you've been doing a type of editing, this will just kind of systematize the process that I go through. Because when I first started editing, I didn't have a process. I did, but I didn't know it. I didn't know what it was. I hadn't broken it down and made it replicable. So each developmental edit was a bit of it wasn't a gong show, but it was stressful because I didn't have the certainty that I would figure out what they needed, that I would be able to help. Every time it was sort of like a stressful, oh my God, what if I don't find anything wrong with their book? Or what if I can't explain what I find wrong? Or what if, not wrong exactly, but what could use work? What if I'm not articulate enough to give them that information without killing their soul? So that was stressful, which is why I developed a system, which I didn't even know I was doing. And now that's what I teach is the system that I use. And then we'll get into active reading because you're going to get the manuscript tonight. You probably all do active reading. It's just the kind of reading where you're focused. And so I'll just talk about the kinds of comments I might make in the margin. They're mostly categories. Everybody's reading style is different. There's no wrong way to mark up a manuscript, except there are things about tone that, if you haven't done one before, or if you've done it for friends and they said, wow, that was, that was hard to take. You'll be interested in, I'm going to start it a little bit tonight, but mostly next week, we'll talk about ways to phrase things so that writers are receptive to your feedback, because that's the point. And so, it's easy to without even trying, it's quite easy to make a writer get defensive, put them on the defensive when they're reading your comments. So we're going to just talk about that. Not so much tonight, mostly next time, but also you'll have you'll have the manuscript for 2 weeks before you want, if you want feedback on your commentary, before you need to send it to me. So anything you learn next time, you can just go back and apply to the current comments if you have time. And if you don't worry about it. I won't send the writer anything until after the course. So if you did get to the end and you're like, well, I wish I could have done some of those comments over again or taken them out, you'll have that opportunity if you want to. Most people don't, unless their tone was really needed a lot of work, which was unusual. Then we'll talk about the assignments, which is just one thing, and a bit of reading. And then if we have time, we'll do situation reports. Okay. Meet the project and the writer. Here we go. The project is a novella manuscript. You can see by the title that it might be a romance. I know not everybody loves romance. The good news there is that it's not quite a romance, in my opinion. It's got some wiggliness around. It was intended to be a romance, but it's got a little bit of wiggliness around genre, which is great practice for, understanding, actually just looking into the topic and seeing whether it is a romance, is it women's fiction, is it something else? Because the writers you work with won't always know what genre they're writing in. It depends on how much they've interacted with the publishing industry and how much self-education they've done. So it's about 30,000 words, 105 manuscript pages. And it's a developmental edit we're doing. And then the thing about a novella, they are a little bit different from novels, but not in any way that matters for the purposes of what we're going to do in this course. But I will go into the difference. Novels differ from novellas in, to my opinion, 3 areas: length, complexity, and focus. So novels are at least 50,000 words, unless you're talking about middle grade, which can be a bit lower. But the average for a first novel, publishers say to aim for 75 to 90,000 words. It's, or actually, I think it's agents that say, who knows who says that? Anyway, that's the accepted norm. Fantasy, sci-fi, historical can be a bit longer because they require more world building. So it's not unheard of for somebody to pitch a first-time fantasy novel at 100,000 words or something like that. One of the students in a previous cohort, fantastic editor named C and CEE, and she wanted to specialize in doorstopper speculative fiction. She just really loved big, huge, fat, way too long things. And so whether to help people cut them down or, to just make them work at the length they're at, because it is a little easier if you're self-publishing to make it whatever length you want. Anyway, so the length is, it will affect your reading time, your turnaround time, all kinds of things. But you can count on 75 to 90,000 words as being sort of in the norm of what you'll mainly get if somebody is interested in publishing traditionally. And if it's way too long or way too short, that'll be part of the thing you would comment on. Novellas, 18 to 40,000 words is given as the, what's the word? I guess the length, the definition of length, but that's just opinion. I have found no absolutely, verifiable source that is correct. I say 18 is the bottom range because, it's on par with novella contest word counts. And so some cap out at 20K, some prefer closer to 30K. Novella publishers are a little more fluid, but you're safe in the 18 to 40,000 word range. I've read some really, really long short stories that are 15 or 16,000 words. And there's another form called the novelette, which we won't even get into because I don't want to, because it's not relevant. Novels have complexity. They have a bigger canvas. There's more pages, so you can have more characters, more plot threads. It's not unusual in novels to have, main plot and a couple of subplots. If there's more than one point of view, there can be multiple plot threads, some of which, get resolved fairly early, or they begin at different times in the main plot thread, and they will resolve at different times in the main plot thread. And usually in novels, more time passes, although there are novels with, that take place in an evening. What am I thinking of? There's an Ian McEwan novel. I forget what it's called. It's about this wedding. Oh, on Chesil Beach. And it covers an evening, but it also goes back and forward in time, just like Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. It moves back and forward in time, visits different points of view, but it's about a day in Mrs. Dalloway's life when she's preparing for a party. So everything has exceptions. Complexity for novellas is usually a little tighter. They're often about a specific central experience. So maybe a particular betrayal, or like Death in Venice. A man falls in love when he's on holiday in Venice, and then he gets sick because he can't bring himself to leave when his love interest is still there. I put a quote in your package from a writer named Fred Bush, writing about novellas, and I'll just read you this snippet of it. The novella is a hybrid with room for several characters and the strand of story that each carries. It permits a multiplicity of concerns that the story tends not to support, but it focuses more narrowly than the novel. For the reader, it's a fuller experience than the short story, perhaps less dramatically emphatic as to the moment of realization, but still offering a sense of both drama and more conscious thought about a matter and a moment than the short story. Finally, there's the publishing landscape, which novels are just easier to get published. There are some publishers who will work with novellas. They used to be published more often as part of a collection of short stories. So if anybody's read George Saunders' collection, Pastoralia, Pastoralia is basically novella length, that particular story, and then there's shorter stories in with it. They can be a hard sell as a standalone book, novellas. It's hard to say with self-publishing whether something is a novel or a novella, because they don't have word count. It depends on your e-reader, what it's set to, how many pages it's going to be. So you can, especially in certain genres like erotica, you don't need a full novel. There's not a lot of plot in those. So it depends. For self-publishers, you can wiggle around and get a 40,000 word manuscript set up to look like a full-length novel. And if you do it well, it will even feel like a full-length novel. So there's nothing wrong with, skating around the word counts. I write novellas every year. I write one novella in 3 days. Did I mention that last time? The 3-day International 3-day Novel Contest. Those are generally novellas. It's hard to even type a novel in 3 days, even if somebody else wrote it first. So I write them for that. I edit novellas for clients in all genres. For one client, he was a TV writer. So he wrote them as scripts for a TV show, originally, the storylines, and then he wanted help learning how to write for the page, because the actor will do all of the heavy lifting with interior monologue and things that you wouldn't normally have on a screen. So I edited 9 of those for him, and they were between 17,000 and 20,000 words each. And this was over a period of 3 or 4 years. And he did learn how to write for the page. He learned how to do interior monologue and description and all that stuff, but it was kind of like pulling teeth with the first few, because he just didn't like reading descriptions, so he didn't like writing them either. Okay, so what does it mean for the course? It's mostly practicality. We're doing the dev edit on a novella to give you time to do each step adequately. And it's close enough to give you enough canvas to work with. And the third part comes from the writer's goals. So here's her background. Angela Moody is her name. Normally I do a sample edit before I onboard any manuscript or writer. I like to know what I'm getting into so I can quote. But I didn't for Angela. I did read it just to see if it would work for the course. And it does work for the course. She writes historical fiction. That's her main interest. This is not historical, the one you're going to read. She has one book out that she self-published on Amazon in 2016. It's a Civil War coming-of-age story. And it won the Grace Award for Christian fiction, although she did not intend to write Christian fiction, but it has a young woman that's her parents are Quakers and they're nonviolent and it's the Civil War. So it was a big deal in the storyline and it got nominated. I'm not sure how. She did try querying about 25 agents, which if you've ever tried to get traditionally published, you will know that's not a huge number before stopping. She didn't actually stop. She did stop querying agents. She didn't do a lot of research, so some of them weren't right, she realized later. She did get the book, the self-published one, picked up by a small press. And because she didn't have an agent, she got an intellectual property attorney to review the contract from the press. And he suggested some changes. The press dropped her, saying the changes were unacceptable. They didn't want to negotiate at all. And so she was disoriented and felt like it was an unpleasant experience and just decided to self-publish, which can happen in publishing a surprising amount. Even if it's not a small press, people can get very demoralized trying to, get an agent, do these other things. So even in classes or working with other editors, I've had writers who were scarred by their previous experience. That novella had been edited developmentally. This one has not. It had actually had a read through from a friend of hers who specializes, who does proofreading for romance. But it didn't get a proofread and it didn't get a copy edit and it did get a developmental edit. It's hard to explain what did happen because I didn't see it before her friend read it, but so it doesn't really matter. It might be rougher than you expect is what I'm getting at here. Part of the thing about being a developmental editor is learning not to fix stuff that isn't in your scope of work. So because you can spend a whole bunch of time fixing grammar, punctuation, spelling, sentence structure, taking out repetitions, and then you have no time to analyze the story. Either that or your hourly rate drops way down. So I left it rough. And all I did was add a header with page numbers. And we'll talk more next week about how to ignore the urge to line edit and copy edit when you're doing a developmental edit. So that's Angela's background. Do you need to know a writer's background before you work with them? I didn't used to know much. I get more interested now because I think it helps me see where they're coming from. I don't like to know the story ahead of time. I don't want to talk to them about what their intention was because I want to encounter the story with no filter. If they say, oh, I sort of based it on this time change novel, and then I'm looking for that, I might not have the clear perception that the time shifts don't work. I'll be kind of mediating in my head. So I prefer not to talk about the novel at all with them before I start reading the first time. After I finish the first read, if they want to talk about it, I could talk about it then. Okay, the project, developmental edit. So we're going to go over the core of that. I won't even spend any more time on that. However, there's two little extras. Each writer might have different things they want to add to the core work of a developmental edit. In this case, Angela would love ideas for a better title. And she's also wondering if there's potential to expand it to a full-length novel. In the real world, if the writer asked you to look at these things, you would look at them in a dev edit. For this course, you don't need to. More interested in seeing your core work, through the editorial letter, then, you know, if you have time and your mind works that way, you have ideas for these other 2 points, that's great. Don't feel like you have to though. Okay. What the writer really wants in every interaction I've been part of is clarity. So clarity in how you convey your reading experience to them, your perspective, and your expertise. Whatever you know about fiction that they don't know. Not everything. And since every reader brings themselves to a book, there is no such thing as the objective truth about anybody's manuscript. Even if only a few people posted their self-assessments, but you know, some people love a genre that somebody else just is not into. And that's great. That's as it should be. So there is no such thing as objective truth, but a committed, engaged, professional reader can be incredibly helpful to a writer if the fit is right. Ta-da! Lesson 1. Any questions? Okay, we'll keep going. Cat in a suitcase. This slide is from last week, where the developmental edit comes in. I mentioned it comes early. It's almost always complete. When I first started editing, I took on a project. It was a 60,000 word novel, literary fiction. And the writer didn't, you know, just said, I'm looking for help. And, you know, I did the scope of work and all that stuff. And then I got to the last page and it wasn't finished. It was missing the climax and denouement, even though it was literary fiction, you know, you still need to end the story. So so I ended up working on that one as, you know, sort of really developmental, like helping him figure out what was going to happen next. And that was a surprise. My hourly rate for that was in the single digits, partly because I was slow. I was new to it. I hadn't figured out a system. It took me a while to do everything I did. And also because it wasn't finished. So it was a different scope of work than I had anticipated. But it was fun. You know, I now check to see that it's the complete manuscript. I ask to see the whole manuscript when I do a sample edit. And you can also work with writers in coaching for, like Crystal mentioned, you know, coaching would be a great add-on to the editorial stuff. You didn't quite put it like that, but it is. I do the coaching too. And sometimes if a writer's stuck, and it really just, you know, consists of talking to them about their story. And then it's like a sort of a crucible of ideas, and they will really help themselves. It's more like they just need a witness and somebody to ask them questions. So most of the time they're finished, but not always. I always want to know if they're not finished. And I do ask writers to do as much as they can on their own before they send me a manuscript. But every writer has their own threshold for pain. So I'm working on one right now, set in Nantucket. I might have mentioned it. The mystery, that it's so riddled with surface errors that I'm actually having trouble ignoring them. And I trained myself to ignore them. So the writer did himself a disservice by not running spell check, because my attention has been a little bit fragmented on that. And I talked to him about it when I did the sample edit, and he said, you know, doesn't matter. So I was like, okay. Okay, the goals of the developmental edit. I'm just going to read this. If the short-term goal of developmental editing is the best current book, the long-term goal is the maximum development of the writer's talent and independence. And I think that's what makes it different from copy editing and proofreading. Not so much from line editing. I would say line editing also has that aspect of helping writers bootstrap themselves to a higher level of ability. That is my goal when I work with somebody, is to make myself obsolete. I'd like to be a springboard for greater independence to the writer. If they're self-publishing, they might not always need developmental editing, because they'll get their story chops really honed and they'll be able to do what they need to do. I work with writers who don't actually need developmental editing, but get it anyway because they want somebody else to read their stuff before they send it out. but it'll be a manuscript evaluation versus a full-on developmental edit. And I'll talk about the difference between those in a future week. But they'll, if they're self-publishing, they'll always need copy editing, but they might not need the big picture stuff. And if they're traditionally publishing, they might not need an editor at all, like to pay for themselves, given time, because that stuff gets done in-house. So the next slide, I'm going to start talking about scope of work, which is just a bullet pointed list of things I say I will do for writers. I put it starts with my website. It's not really bullet pointed there. It's more like, here's what's in a developmental edit. Here's what's a manuscript evaluation. Here's what's line editing, copy editing, because I offer those levels. And then as we get further into the onboarding, sample edit, I get a little more detailed. Here's what's included. And it gets more bullet pointy because my objective is to remove confusion or reduce it and manage expectations. So I don't want somebody contracting with me for developmental edit and then coming back at the end and saying, well, look at all these typos. I want them to be very clear all the way through that what the task is that they're contracting for. And the final place where I show the scope of work is in the contract, where it's about as detailed as it's ever going to be. And it includes a schedule and all kinds of other stuff. Okay. So this is the definition. Remove confusion. No, that's just exactly what I just said. Remove confusion, clarify expectations, and that's where it comes in. Okay, so this is quite wordy. I started with this scope of work and I haven't changed it because I find it, it's very clear. But I would expect you to come up with your own scope of work. Obviously, it's the same basic tasks. So we'll start with this, and then as you get used to doing what you're doing and you learn what you like doing, what you don't like doing, and you have your own language around your services, like on your website, then you will just write your own scope of work. It'll gradually evolve, but we'll start with this one. So this is what I say I'm going to do to somebody's novel. And it's pretty detailed. Analyze structure and address issues. Suggest ways to improve plot, setting, characterization, pacing, scene dynamics, and narrative arc. These are the main sort of big picture things developmental editors would look at. Not in that order necessarily. Address whether length and placement of world building information and or backstory strengthens the story and when it should be moved or shortened. So a lot of that I would not do in a letter. I would do it in the manuscript itself. Just say, could cut, could telescope, could make this narrative summary. Oh, there should be a scene that is narrative summary, that kind of stuff. Identify and recommend whether to cut, expand, move, or reorganize scenes. Comment on genre expectations and category norms. I never used to include that at first. I didn't know enough. And the internet wasn't as well developed around what is a genre expectation. So I do comment on that, but you don't have to be a developmental editor. You actually don't have to. Comment on recurring prose issues impacting publishability. I feel I owe this to the writer. If they've got a great, fantastic story and they're going to pitch agents and their prose is terrible, then they need to know that. And I'm the person to tell them. So we'll go into, how you might phrase something like that. But that's basically the scope of work. And then I would add additional items specific to the situation. So once in a while, I'm contracted to work on, say, book 2 in a series or book 4 in a series. And so I would add to the scope of work, read books 1 through 3. And I would charge for my time, but I wouldn't edit those books because they've already been published. So it's just to get to know the characters in the story world. I don't charge a lot for my time for those types of things. I'm a fast reader, but it is extra stuff that I don't do for free. So I arrived at this wording over time. I have actually cleaned it up a little. This is a little wordy. You'll see that it says what I'm going to do, but not what I'm going to deliver or how I'm going to do it. So this isn't really a scope of work as it's phrased in project management terms. This is in your packet, by the way. So you can bounce off it and start developing your own, or wait till after the course and then start developing your own. Or if you've already got one, you can tweak it and add stuff, or you can look at other editorial websites. I do include an explanation of deliverables in my sample edits and on my website, but I'll talk about those separately. So the process I use to do these things is what I'm going to show you over the next 3 weeks, and that's the process you're going to use on Angela's manuscript, unless you hate it, in which case you could use a different process, but it's not bad. Once you know your scope of work, you can develop a way of doing it, a process consistent and useful that gets you to the goal. And the goal is a client who feels understood, who feels that you have helped them identify the strengths and weaknesses with their story, their novel, and who has sort of is motivated and excited about revision. Okay. I get through the edit with a 5-stage process, and I arrived at it, as I mentioned, I think by trial and error. It's not that complicated overall. And within each of the 5 stages, there are actions or steps. Excuse me for I have everybody muted except my kids, and one of them is texting me. Okay, yeah, the 5 stages are the steps I take with every developmental edit I do. That's what makes it a system. It reduces overwhelm for sure. I've taught it to an editor who apprenticed with me, a writing friend of mine named Doug, and it worked for him too. It's worked for the students in this course who've come from all backgrounds and all types of experiences. I'm sure everybody has tweaked it to fit with their schedule and their own approach, but it's generally, I think it's a pretty solid system. It aligns with how my brain operates. So what I would say is you'll try it a few times maybe afterwards and see how it goes. Anytime you try it, just change anything that doesn't work for you. Okay, so here it is. Understanding the manuscript as it is. Diagnosing issues. Considering context. Identifying solutions. And telling the writer. This is only halfway through that lesson. Are we ready for a break, or should I go a little bit longer and then we'll take a break? If you're ready for a break, raise your hand. Okay, you guys. There we are. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, I'm going to take you through the 5 stages. You don't have to memorize any of this. We're actually just going to do it, and it's in your packet. And it's in the, I put in an excerpt from that book I wrote on fiction editing for writers, which also talks about the 5 stages that I go through. So you'll see these steps again and again over the next 4 weeks. Understanding the manuscript as it is. This requires just absorbing it and thinking about it as you read. You're not adding anything. You're not, you're not really getting ideas for changes yet, although they might strike you. What it involves your reading sensibility, so your keen attention to an awareness of the text as you read. And you've already got it, and if you feel like it's maybe not that honed, you can develop it. That is the focus of weeks 2 through 4. So I do a couple things to understand the manuscript as it is. The first is a close reading, where I mark it up with comments in the manuscript, often just to track my reading experience more than talking to the writer. I'll go through those comments before I deliver the edit and take out anything that was just me thinking to myself in a way that isn't helpful to the writer. And then the other thing I do to understand it the way it is we're going to do in week 4, which is the book map. Fantastic tool. Love it or hate it. It's really, 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 really good. So you'll be reading the novella this week and next week. You have 2 weeks, which is quite a long time. It's probably a 2-hour read, but you're you're marking it up, so it takes a bit longer. And that will help you really absorb the story on a deep level, not just what the story is, but how it's told. Reading it will give you sort of a mid-range view, you know, how are characters coming in? How are they introduced? What are the scenes like? Do they have it, you know, is it a good scene? Is it a boring scene? Are you drifting? You'll be able to see issues with characterization, you know, if the character is unlikable or hard to relate to, or has no goals, that type of stuff. You'll be able to see if there's confusion in the point of view, things like that. You might not have a good sense just from reading of the novella's structure or its plot events, like what happens in what order. But then when you do the book map in week 4, everything that is still hazy about how the story is put together will become clear, because you'll take it apart. The book map reverse engineers the book, and you can do them on nonfiction. I think I mentioned that. I know a couple of you work mostly on nonfiction or like nonfiction. So anything that you can do in a developmental edit for fiction, in terms of the process, you can do on nonfiction. Even if I'm not contracted for a book map, like if I'm doing a manuscript evaluation, I'll sometimes do a quick book map for myself after the first read to figure out what's going on, because it's a great tool. Okay, oops. Then diagnosing issues. Anybody recognize this fellow? Sherlock Holmes. When I was a kid, I read so much Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie. It's ridiculous. So diagnosis is sort of like his method. You look at everything you've discovered and understood in the first stage, and you come to some conclusions about what the issues are. And by the time you're done the book map and you're into, you know, you're into the point where you're thinking about how to really conceptualize your experience of the novel and what, you know, what to tell the writer works in your opinion and what needs work in your opinion. Some things you'll intuit on the first read, but diagnosing is slightly different from intuiting. You actually you get a little more specific on what you think the strengths and weaknesses are. The diagnosis part comes gradually as you read the manuscript and do a book map. You see things that could be improved. This is why when I mark up a manuscript, like right in the novels, I don't censor myself at all, because something that was just a passing thought when I read a scene will become important later. It'll be clear that that is actually a symptom of a bigger problem, or that it happens a lot. So I don't censor myself at all. You're not telling the writer anything yet. So when I read, I tend to notice everything and then decide which problems are developmental or big picture and which are more to do with style. The tricky thing about diagnosing is that everything in novels is related. You can say something's a plot issue, but it's usually more than plot. It's about characterization often, and sometimes structure. So let's say a plot point has a character saving someone's life. That might be what's needed for the story to move forward. But if that life-saving scene comes out of nowhere, or if the character has been portrayed as timid and slow to act, or there are issues of logic or credibility, like they suddenly know how to fly a plane or do a tracheotomy, and that hasn't been established earlier, then it's more than a plot issue. It's an issue with characterization and with establishing the status quo at the beginning of the novel. So, although diagnosing can be tricky, rest assured that by allowing yourself time and space to fully engage with the manuscript, and by doing a book map, if there are issues, you will find them. Which comes to the inevitable question: what if a novel has no issues? Or what if they're really minor? We'll talk about that in week 5, the editorial letter. But I would say, trust the process. Of course, I would say that, but I mean it. Okay, stage 3, considering context. That's when I stop engaging directly with the manuscript and start thinking more about the writer, the publishing landscape, and the genre. I have to do that to address publishability in the editorial letter. For me, I didn't initially. I also do it because it gives the writer more information about the viability of their book. And there's a kind of a fine, it can be awkward to talk to writers about whether their book is publishable, because any book theoretically is publishable, but not all books. I don't publish books, for one thing. When I got an agent first, one of the early things she said to me was, after it got turned down by a couple of the big 5 imprints, I'm not a whiner. We were just chatting, and she said, if I had a publishing company, I'd publish it. But as an independent editor, or even if you work for a publisher, you are not in the decision seat. It's so you can tell a writer, yeah, I would publish it if it was my publishing house, but that doesn't actually mean much, except it will bolster their feelings about the book. The other thing that has happened, it's happened twice, and it probably would have happened more if I had encouraged it at all, which is that writers will say to me, what would you give me on a scale of 1 to 5? What would you say my book's chances are? 1 being not a hope in hell, 5 being it's a shoo-in. Or, what are my percentage chances? So the first time a writer asked me that, I didn't answer. I refused to answer. I wrote a blog post on why I refused to answer, because it's such a complicated question, and so much of it is up to the writer. And that's for traditional publishing. But another writer that I worked with recently on book 1 of a 3-book series, and he's aiming for traditional publication. It's high concept. It's a little too long for a first novel, but not out of control too long. And he asked me, and I just answered, because I thought he was like a dog with a bone, this guy, like our first, not a bad way, just very focused on being a successful writer. And on our first call, normally I give a call after each edit, and it's an hour, sometimes 90 minutes. It was 4 hours. He wanted to go through every single comment. And so I knew I knew that he wanted an answer, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. So I told him 50-50. And I saw his face drop, because nobody wants to hear 50-50. But I knew he could take it, because he's that kind of guy. It would just make him persist even more. And you have to be truthful with writers. It's impossible to say what their chances are. However, you can say what's under the control and what's not under the control. So when I'm talking about context, I'm talking about their goals. If they're self-publishing, it's 100% under their control, whether they get the book out. If it's successful or not is also under their control. Depends on how much time and energy and money they want to put into it. Marketing, all of that stuff matters a lot when you're self-publishing. Publishing landscape. That has to do with things beyond anyone's control, actually. However, sometimes I'll comment, like World War II has gotten a little bit oversaturated, I would say, in historical fiction. That's just my opinion. I'll say it could be a challenge because of that. And that'll change. It'll come back. Everything is cyclical. So I'm not didactic about it, but I do say what I think might affect their novel. And in the case of, if they've written a World War II novel, and I think World War II has gotten oversaturated, I'll just be, during the edit, I'll say we need it. It would be great to have a high concept twist here for your novel to get picked up, even though it's set in World War II. And so if they already have one, that's great. We'll just bring it out. And if they don't already have one, then I'll look for ways to include that. There are other things that go back to their goals. Like, what did they ask for help with? Did they have any special requests? So Angela's were title, and is it expandable? I've been hired to help cut down a 210,000 word manuscript by 80,000 words. Just cut a novel out of a novel. It was still a bit long, but it was historical fiction. It was beautifully written. But no agent will look at a huge book from a first-time writer unless they already know them. I don't know if you remember the writer I told you about last week, my friend Larry. He was a former political cartoonist who had his big historical novel being on submission to the big imprints of the big five. He had a high-powered agent in New York. It was a great concept. And it was on submission for so long that he developed this line of books for middle grade readers and published them himself, reluctant readers, and made some nice dough out of that. Well, there is more to Larry's story. So the book his agent couldn't sell was around 200,000 words originally. And he cut it down on his own and with beta reads from schmucks like me to about 180,000 words. So it was still too long, but he had a big platform. So his agent took him on anyway. So it was based on a real historical figure on the coast of China, one of the most successful female pirates in the world ever in the history. I don't know how many successful female pirates there are, but he knew there were too many battles. And so he didn't know which ones to cut. And he had gotten to that stage of knowing what the problem was long after I was one of his early beta readers. So his agent suggested he worked with an editor. And this editor had worked in the Big Five for decades. She gave him a specific name, was well regarded. He contracted with that editor for what he thought was going to be a developmental edit, and he paid $9,000 US. And she did not deliver. She forgot to address which battles could be cut or conflated. When they spoke on the phone afterwards and he asked her which battles to cut, she didn't know because she hadn't formed an opinion, because she had not sufficiently considered his problem. So what he asked to be in the scope of work, and she said she would look at, she didn't look at. So that's part of the context. You got to look at whatever's in the scope of work. Sometimes I'll go back before I deliver and just double check the contract, make sure I didn't leave anything off. Because when you work on more than one manuscript at a time, it can be easy to get them not mixed up exactly, but not 100% oriented. And then the other context issue is genre expectations. If it's a thriller, are the stakes high enough? There's just certain, if it's a romance, is there a happily ever after or a happily for now? If it's middle grade, does it accord with expectations around vocabulary, sexuality, word count, language? Although if you've ever read Anne of Green Gables, that's got very complex language. I don't know how many non-Canadians would ever read that book. Anyway, so that's context. And I do that as part of it. It just takes an hour, not even. I'm thinking about it on my walk home kind of stuff. And then I identify solutions. Before we get into the solutions, because this is a little bit of a long thing, let's take that break. I'm gonna back up to that slide. Just for anybody who's watching on replay and they're like, where's the break? Okay. So I'll see you in 5 minutes, 4:28 my time. I'm gonna mix things up a little. What? Catherine, your note made me laugh. I just thought.
I feel like we didn't need to capture that on video forever. Me stuffing my face with pizza. So.
Yeah, it'll never. Once stuff is out there, it's brutal. I taped a video with Susanna, and my shirt was way too tight. I didn't realize it, and it's always going to be there on YouTube. And I'm like,
oh no.
One of those. You know, before we continue with identifying solutions, I actually want to do our sit reps now, because if I start motoring off at the mouth, I won't get a chance to hear from you guys. So I don't have any particular question, but I don't have a slide, but I think what I'm curious about is, what am I curious about? Just if you can talk a little bit about what you think so far of whether you're going to get anything out of this course. It's not to get, is this the right course, and do you feel like this is going to teach you anything? Or what do you plan to do afterwards? That way there's no pressure. So I'm going to call names. Catherine, you muted yourself. Not quick enough.
Yeah, no, I think this course seems like a good sort of complementary course to the ones I've taken. I've taken a few courses with the same instructor, and she was really great, but just I wanted to hear someone else's perspective, and I know different people approach the process differently. Yeah. And this course seems to include some of the more like business aspects and genre aspects and things that the prior courses I took didn't cover. So I think this will really help round out my understanding in the way that I hoped it would.
Great. And what's your plan for after? I looked at everybody's thing, but I'm getting a little mixed up.
I don't have a super specific plan. I may try to do some part-time, like freelance developmental editing in the next couple of years. My day job keeps me pretty busy, but something that I think I might like to transition to longer term. So just trying to get my feet wet now, and maybe do there's a website that I do like critiquing and beta reading and stuff through, that I might try to do it on just like a free basis to build some skills, and then maybe later on try to make money off of it. But for now, really just learning and kind of undecided about what path I'll pursue. And if nothing else, it'll probably help with my writing. So
absolutely. Actually, there's one of the students in an earlier cohort, Melinda, she is on Critters. I don't know if it's still called that. And she's actually, she's not a writer herself. So she's a really talented editor. And she's, she's noticed a couple of writers on there that are really great, that are just that she wants to help kind of mentor. So she's working with them for the experience, just because she's got a day job, as well. And down the road, probably quite far down the road, she's young and she's an engineer, so she's not really super interested in working in the publishing industry yet, but it's kind of like she can use her skills to work part-time on the side. If she gets lots of paid vacation, she can do a couple of manuscripts, that kind of stuff. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Maggie.
I knew I was going to be next. No, I think so far it's what I'm looking for. I was trying to bone up on some skills, and an editor I worked with has taken your class before and spoke very highly of it and was like, you can take that class, take it. So I had high hopes coming in, and it seems like it's what I need. Already reading the stuff, I'm like, oh, that's already useful to me. Great. Both with my own writing and the stuff that I'm editing. And after, I'm hoping to be able to divide my time. I'm a counselor for my day job, and it's incredibly draining, so I want to be able to do multiple things to have my income, rather than solely hear trauma 40 hours a week, because that's a lot. So yeah, so that's my plan. Yes,
I think that's a great plan. And editing is one of those things you can do 2 manuscripts a year, or
yeah, I'm a fast reader. I read over 150 books a year, so that's why I started editing again, because I can bust them out in a month if I'm doing an actual edit of it. So I'm just if I do that with my time now and I do all the counseling, like might as
Yeah.
well.
That's great. Well, you never know where things will go. I started out editing. I didn't even plan to become an editor. I just realized it was a job. And then, excuse me while I adjust my camera. And then, now I'm getting into teaching and other stuff, coaching. But I love editing still. So it's one of those things where as you get sort of used to one part and it's more or less floats your boat or doesn't, you can segue to other aspects of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Crystal.
So I do think I'm in the right place. I've been kind of doing my own kind of digging around on the internet for a while, so I really like that this actually has a structure to work within and to build off of. After this, I do have some other courses lined up through Club Ed. So I have like the 1 through 6 dev editing, and then I was going to take the advanced course once I'm able to do that. But yeah, I mean, long-term big plan is doing dev editing and copy, line, and coaching. So the whole bit. Yeah, that's the long-term game.
Excellent. Yes. Well, I work full-time as an editor and other stuff, and it's a really great way to make a living. And I did take an intermediate dev editing course through Jennifer Lawler that's who runs Club Ed, right? When she was teaching through the EFA.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked it. Yeah, a good experience. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Ashley.
Echoing what everybody said, yeah, I think I'm in the right place. I like just having ideas of a structured process because I think with editing, with writing, I'm a freelance writer and editor, and when I've added on new services or things to do, I just kind of fly by the seat of my pants. So it's really nice to have like an actual scope of work to include and a process that I can kind of follow and copy and take and make my own. I think even just that alone, like, it makes this class really helpful.
Great. Yeah. I'm a big believer in systems.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes because then, well, I'll talk your ears off about systems, but good. Glad to hear it. Thank you. Greta?
Yeah. Oh, so far I've been feeling like this is a really good fit. This is the first developmental editing course or editing course in general that I have taken. And I am looking at adding it as a freelancing gig in addition to a day job that I would kind of like to escape the field that I'm in. I've been pigeonholed into kind of like a computer programming and stats role, and I would really like to pivot more towards writing and editing because that's what I love and what I do anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to develop my skills for kind of supporting others in my writing group. I really am kind of interested in that like coaching aspect too, or at least like helping people execute their creative visions. But yeah, I would like to look at adding it as another revenue stream too.
Yeah, great. Really great. Thank you all. Back to our regular programming. So, I really like the little bit of a go round just because it helps humanize us all. And I am a bit of an egomaniac, but I'm not that much of one. And I feel like it's more fun for me if I get to see you guys and understand where you're coming from, because then I can respond more. We have a short time together. And I don't by any means know everything about anything, but I do know some stuff about what you're here for. And so a little bit of personal experience can go a long way in terms of if you do run into a situation where I've said something like, oh yeah, that could happen that way, you won't be thrown for a loop to the point where you contemplate quitting the industry. Because depending on how the writers that you work with are, it can be it takes some people I won't say people skills, but people, what's the word, it takes some distance. Really, it took me a while. I used to get sort of overly committed and involved with the writer having to the book had to be the best it could possibly be. And now, although I'm still very interested and engaged in helping them bring their stuff up, it's not, I know that they will survive regardless of whether they do everything I'm suggesting or not. It's always their own experience. Okay, let's go back to identifying solutions. If your eyes glaze over on this slide, if you start like having to swallow yawns, just turn off your video or do it. Fake a fire alarm, because this one is kind of, it might just sound like a bunch of jargon, but I'm going to have to say it because now is the time. So don't think like you have to know any of this, by the way. It's just kind of to let the sound wash over you and become familiar with, if you aren't already familiar with, what is big picture, where does that, what can it look like when big picture issues arise, basically. Okay, big picture problems require big picture solutions. And I talk about the jargon of fiction. I don't really consider it jargon. It's just a way of talking about things. So I'm talking things like scene dynamics or narrative modes, all of which I'm going to go into with my explanation of it. Even just plot or a dramatic structure, all of that, the way people talk about fiction, characterization, character arc. It can sound like jargon if you're a writer who sat down and wrote a novel first time. You haven't taken a lot of courses in writing, or even none, you're just an avid reader and you want to write something. You might not know that vocabulary, but it's the editor's job to know that vocabulary. So that's why it's going to come up. Some of you already know a ton about the craft of fiction. And so I'm hoping the information I give will be a refresher. Solutions often end up being structural. It seems odd to start with structure, but that is more like the end result. The structural issues can involve cutting scenes, moving them, starting the book in a different place, conflating scenes, so joining two or merging them so they make one better scene. It's pretty rare for me to suggest starting a novel in a different place, sometimes with a short story. I mean, more often with a short story. And structure can also refer to backstory and flashback, even plot threads. I did an edit early in, I guess it was January, where I suggested to the writer he add a plot thread. That's unusual. I haven't done that a lot, but the book needed it. And he was going to do it. I don't see their books after, so I'm not always sure if they did it, but he planned to do it. Sometimes the issues are around characterization, and this can lead to all kinds of suggestions for solutions. Characterization has a lot to do with whose point of view the story is from, and also psychic distance. How close are we to the character's thoughts? Are we inside their head, arm's length, a block away, and a psychic distance moves in and out in almost every novel. And of course, point of view, there's these basic categories: first person, third person, and so on. There's also objective, like Dashiell Hammett, if anybody's read him, an old noir mystery writer, or Hemingway. You don't actually know what the characters are thinking. You just know what they're saying and doing. And then there's this thing called connectivity. There's a great little book. I think I put it in the week one packet by Thomas McCormack. It's kind of old fashioned. It was reissued in 2007 by a Philadelphia publisher. It's called The Fiction Writer. Well, I can't remember what it's called. It's in your packet. It's by Thomas McCormack. Anyway, when he's talking about connectivity, it's about how characters interact and the braiding of their storylines. So how often do they see each other and talk to each other? How do they know each other? If there isn't enough of a connection among the characters, a novel can feel episodic. It's like there's just these set piece scenes happening and there's no feeling of movement. And that will flatten out the reading experience. So connectivity can also have to do with an external source of tension that's common to all of the characters, like a tsunami. it can be, there's more than one way of connecting characters. They don't need to necessarily be in each other's worlds. But if you see a novel or work with a novel where things don't feel like they cohere very well, it might have something to do with connectivity. And I didn't read that book till 2016, and I started editing in like 2010. And that just was a light bulb moment for me when I went, that's what's wrong when that's wrong. You know what it feels like, but you don't exactly know what it is. And he explained it in that book. So sometimes that involves even making two weaker characters into a stronger character and giving them more of a role. And you would potentially suggest something like that. You'll see an example of where you could suggest that actually in Destination Wedding. You might not, but so it is a big picture suggestion, that type of thing, but it has page by page ramifications, as do all developmental editing suggestions. Then there's plot and pacing. So I mentioned earlier, character issues might be plot issues and vice versa. But even on the level of, if a character is so unlikable or so distant that readers will have a hard time attaching to them, one solution could be inserting what in showbiz is called a save the cat moment, where they do something nice right at the beginning, so the reader's more sympathetic. And ideally that thing that they do will be related to later events. I think Chekhov called it a pat the dog moment. So that idea has been around for a while. You don't have to like all the characters, readers don't, or even the protagonist. I think, I know for sure, one of you mentioned being interested in novels where the character is not necessarily likable. I'm paraphrasing really badly, hatchet job. They're not necessarily likable, but you're still interested in what happens to them. That's what I'm talking about. I like characters sometimes who are hard to like, but you want to follow them. You want to know what they're going to do next. So if the character is off-putting and the prose is not high enough quality to keep the reader going just because they like the sentences. But that's the thing about literary fiction. You can have, somebody mentioned John Banville. He writes two kinds of prose. One is literary fiction under his own name, and I think he's won like the Booker Prize and various novel prizes, but he also writes under another name, mysteries. And his characters are not that likable. They're pretty flawed, but his prose is fantastic, especially in the literary fiction ones. So, I keep reading those, even though I don't love his characters. So there's solutions. Sometimes a save the cat is a good solution, but sometimes adding an incident is not a good solution. It might be something that you would suggest just letting us more deeply into the character's head to create more connection to the reader. And that goes back to psychic distance. And then there's other things that can affect plot and pacing. Sometimes I'm drifting, and I always trust my reading sensibility. And I urge you all to trust yours too. You're drifting for a reason. You're never going to be the only reader drifting. Sometimes it's got to do with you haven't had a glass of water in 10 hours and you need to stand up. But most of the time it's got to do with something on the page. So the idea when I find myself drifting is that I feel like it's a plot or a pacing issue quite often. And I'll just notice where I'm drifting in the first read, and I just write in the margin, I'm drifting. And if I know why, I'll write why. And that is a note for me, but I'll leave them in sometimes if it's a writer that I know wants to know that kind of stuff. So I have one of my clients that we've worked on a few novels together, and he's like, the last thing I want the last thing I want is one of Pat's dreaded I'm drifting comments. So he will he'll make a scene better because he doesn't want me drifting, which is great. That's really why we're here in some ways. Sometimes it can, depending on what kind of novel it is, it can work to suggest adding a ticking clock or upping the stakes. Or sometimes when I'm drifting on a read, it's just juxtaposition. There's too many scenes in a coffee shop in a row, you know, and it's just talking heads, nobody's moving. So it can be easy to see or feel when you're reading that kind of lack of momentum or that feeling of drifting, but it's not always easy to solve. A novel can be full of jump cuts and time changes without feeling episodic, you know, without feeling like it's all too all over the place. But sometimes a novel that marches forward in chronological time can also feel episodic and disconnected, just because the deeper connective tissue isn't there. I know I sound like a weirdo talking about connective tissue in novels, but I think if you know what I mean. You'll know when you see it, or you might not be able to quite, you know, you won't know if what you think I'm talking about is also what I'm talking about. But by the time we get to the end of the course, we'll have a much better shared vocabulary around what it feels like when a story isn't working and how you can articulate that to writers. So if a story has no forward momentum, or it feels like you could switch the order of scenes, and it wouldn't make any difference, I do an analysis of the cause and effect chain, and I do that with the book map. That cause and effect analysis is a gift to writers. I did it for my own stuff, and I was like, oh my God, these 10 scenes don't even need to be anywhere. I could pull them out and the novel would be exactly the same. So I'll do that, and suggestions there. Solutions are also usually around moving, dropping, or adding scenes. So they're not small ones. Scene dynamics I find very interesting. You can have a bunch of great scenes and they might not hang together as a novel, but if you have a really hung together, you know, well-constructed plot without any great scenes, it's not going to be fun to read. So the scene is important. It's the building block, of course. Well, I shouldn't say of course, but it is a big deal in contemporary fiction anyway. And issues with scene dynamics might arise when the prose is not very good. Sometimes that can sort of make a scene feel static, or there's not enough conflict, or there's no conflict, or the characters don't want anything. And the conflict can be internal. You can be have a character completely alone in a scene and still have great dynamics. Or if the dialogue is pedestrian, that can be a big problem. So prose is not a developmental edit's main focus, but it can and should be raised when that's the problem with a scene, I think. Sometimes I will line edit a scene. If there's a habitual kind of underhitting, you know, it's not that interesting to read because the prose is too mushy, or the dialogue tags are nuts, you know, or something like that. I'll take 3 pages and line edit it. That's about 1,000 words. And I'll line edit it heavily, not to persuade them to hire me as a line editor, because that's not my goal. It's to let them get a sense of, if they looked at that line edited section in original, you know, in the different page views you can get in Word, and they read it, they would feel a complete difference between what their normal writing style is like and what their line edited writing style is like. The first time I got line edited, I could not believe how many extra words I'd been using. I was blown away. And I could see, you know, it was a good feeling to be heavily line edited. So anyway, I might do that when scene dynamics are an issue, but sometimes it's just the scene doesn't need to be there, or there's not enough conflict, or it's not going anywhere. There's a fantastic book by Sandra Schofield, which isn't on the list. I don't know if anybody's read it. It's called The Scene Book, and I'll put it in the in Slack because I just read it and I love it. Okay, concept, premise, and theme. These are huge in developmental editing. And we're going to spend an entire craft module on those because they matter so much. There's definitions of concept and premise, but we'll just, you know, keep it pretty light for this class, and that's to say it's the idea behind the story. It's sort of the big idea. It's the log line. If you had to explain the story in 3 sentences or 2 sentences, it's the concept. So if you look at the New York Times bestseller list, their concept is the one sentence descriptor of the story. I'll post some on Slack. And the premise is usually about 5 sentences. It's the bones of your query letter, any writer's query letter, or if you're on Amazon, it's the book cover, the book description. You know, what makes it interesting to read? That's the premise. We'll go into that a lot, but that is something I would look at. Some writers already have it when you get the manuscript, and some writers, that's the thing that needs the most honing, and that's getting that figured out will make their path to revision super clear, because it's the whole underpinning for the book. Well, that wasn't too bad. There's no one right solution for any issue. So those are kind of the big picture things you're going to look at in any developmental edit. There's maybe a little bit more than that. They each have extra aspects to them, but that's it right there. And the solutions are big picture. They're moving, cutting, rewriting, and there's no one right solution. So your job really is to identify, what works, what doesn't work, and then offer ideas and spark the writer's creativity to the degree that you are interested in doing. Okay. Telling the writer. This is the final stage, stage 5. You use the deliverables to tell the writer. So that's what we're doing in this course. You're going to have the marked up manuscript annotated with your comments, the book map, if you offer them in your dev edits. In this course, I would recommend doing the book map, but I'm not going to give feedback on it, but I will send it to the writer afterwards. And then the editorial letter. And if you want me to see the book map, I would love to see it. I really find it interesting how different book maps can look. I give you a template, but I did a practicum at one point for this course early on, and it was amazing. Writers used Plotter and little note card things, colored stuff. You can get away from Excel, that sort of boring looking list, and do anything you want for book maps. There's no perfect way. So this stage is fun. You've got the manuscript markup, which I go through and make sure there's nothing completely objectionable in there. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I would also take out because it's too repetitive. Some stuff I say in the editorial letter doesn't need also to be in the manuscript, so I'll have it in one or the other. Those 3 things, and then there's also the conversation with the writer. But first, let's look at what these 3 things look like in my world. Manuscript markup. I don't know if you can read this. You don't need to. It's in your packet, actually. So this is a combination. This is a science fiction. Oh, no, it was a science fiction novel. And it's a combination of reaction and then sort of a bigger picture commentary that's mostly for myself at this point. This was on the first read. So my reaction to this moment when one of the characters wipes a tear off the other character's face was sweet. And then my thought to myself, I probably should have hard returned, was I'm not feeling the story engine in X's point of view. Feels like the status quo is a bit too prolonged. So I'm having like these more distant thoughts. And that comes, I think, partly from experience. You wouldn't necessarily expect yourself to have those types of thoughts when you're on the first read, but you might, I don't know. And then again, this one is similarly structured. I'm responding to the moment on the page, and I would definitely leave that kind of thing in, because it's good for the writer to be able to read over your shoulder and see what you're feeling and what you think about the characters. And then below that, I may or may not leave that in when I'm delivering the manuscript. But this one says, I think this ask is the heart of the exchange between X and Y. So one of them asks the other one to do something. And at 1900 words, I mean, the scene is 1900 words. It takes a lot of early real estate in the book. Maybe the bar scene in this one could be merged into one more efficient, powerful scene. So these are thoughts I would probably develop more for the editorial letter. It's a lot to have somebody kind of respond to when they're just reading your comments. But I just wanted to show you what that looks like when I do them. Here's a little picture of a book map. No need to try and read this. It's in your packet. But this was a murder mystery, and there were no there were chapter numbers, but they were all sorted by timeline. There was at least 3 points of view. And then I kind of just describe what happens in 2 or 3 lines. So a 3-page or a 10-page scene might end up being 5 or 6 lines kind of thing. And then there was 2 storylines in this particular novel. One was about suicide/murder, and another one was about embezzlement. So one of the characters had been framed. Then thematic elements. These columns I don't always have in each one because each book map reflects the novel. So I might not have thematic elements as a column, but in this one I did. Nature as healer, what is normal, family versus caregiver. I want to kind of trying to understand the connectivity between this among the characters in this sort of it was well constructed, but I wanted to feel the story engine. So I was taking it apart a little bit. I do word count. I don't know if other editors do this. I like to know, is something happening at 10%? Like I don't actually believe in that whole Freytag triangle Hollywood thing as a way you have to write a book. I think the book is an organic form, but I do like to check if nothing has changed in the first 30% of the book, then I like to know that. So I do percentages. And then I have just a random column heading that over time I would flesh out. I would sort of pick one thing, but in early times I called it notes, suggestions, and questions. And I don't always, I fill that in at the very end. So I'll explain how I do that at the when we go through book map. So that's the second tool. Third tool. It's illegible because the point isn't the text right now. I will give you like 2 examples of editorial letters. But this is how my editorial letters look. I'll just back up a bit. It's important because it frames the experience to me. It's the thing I ask writers to read first when I deliver the edit. Say, here's what's, here's your stuff, the letter, the la la la, and then I suggest you start with the letter as it explains all. So because novels are complicated, and the editorial letter helps corral, your recommendations for revision, because, well, first your experience of the novel, but then also your recommendations, your sort of stance on what would do it the most good, what really works, because writers can, lose perspective on what's working. As a writer myself, I have ripped out stuff that was the best part, and then didn't realize till 5 years later when I'm thinking about why that novel's still under the bed, because I butchered it. I didn't have enough perspective. And, so there's what works, the way I do them, what works, what needs work, and then sort of a little bit of a, revision pathway that they could look at taking. Mine is in some ways it's quite vague, but it's got a certain number of steps. And recommendations for revision, they can be wide ranging, especially when I first started developmentally editing fiction. I was not good at prioritizing big stuff from little stuff that would make a huge difference if that's all you changed in the novel, from stuff that, would be nice to have in scene 92. So what I found was that although writers were, my edits were well received, I realized as time went on that writers don't have an endless capacity for absorbing feedback on their book. So the editorial letter organizes the feedback and insight into a form the writer can make sense of. And there's as many ways to write a editorial letter as there are editors. They can be short or they can be long. Some editors do multiple rounds with a short letter on each aspect, like one for character. I don't think freelance editors do it that way very often because it extends the whole process. So in-house editors will often do it that way. But it's hard to cost, basically, it becomes more of a coaching thing if you're doing it that way. It took a few years for me to arrive, to get a solid letter that allowed me to convey my findings with a lot of clarity. So I don't really use a template, except that it's on letterhead. but I do follow a certain flow, which I'll give to you in week 5. You'll see that I actually labeled it editorial letter. It's really not necessary, but when I was in my there's a reason I do it. It's sort of like a joke to my earlier self. I won a novel writing contest where the first prize was publication. And so I got this book published and it was reviewed and I was interviewed, which on the Canadian version of NPR. And I got this fax. I don't know if you've heard of those from, just kidding. I mean, they're historical. Fax from an acquisitions editor at Doubleday, which was used to be a publisher, who had read the book and wanted to see anything else I was working on. So I wrote another novel immediately. So the one I won the contest with was my first novel. This was my second one. It was a mess. I sent her the manuscript and she sent me back this 3-page note with bullet points about things she'd like to see changed. And I didn't know anything about publishing. I didn't know it was an editorial letter. I had no idea. I thought it meant she didn't like the book. And, if I'd really thought about it, I would have realized, well, there's no way she's going to write a 3-page letter to say no. But I just had no clue. I was young and she was suggesting a lot of work. I didn't realize that it was really a revise and resubmit request in some ways. And I was just leaving for a year of budget traveling around the world. So when I got back from my trip, I just started a new book. It took me probably over a decade to realize that that was an editorial letter. So now, as a nod to me and that editor, I title all my stuff. If it's a memo, I say memo, I'm just as clear as all get out with every document that leaves my hand. There's no harm in clarity. Okay, here's one of my favorite parts. Even though I was telling you about that 4-hour call, I still really enjoy this part. 60 to 90 minutes. Usually I budget for 60 and then sometimes it goes longer. Used to be a Skype call before Zoom, and before Skype it was a phone call. And I do it because in some cases this is the first time the writer has had a chance to talk about their book with somebody who knows it and who has perspective on it and who can make suggestions. So one thing I would say is that if you feel, not enthused about or not ready to talk to writers, there's absolutely no imperative to offer it. I was initially a little worried they'd say something like, what about that giant plot hole in the middle? I was surprised you didn't mention that. I'd be like, oh, there's a plot hole? I thought it would reveal my ignorance. So you don't have to offer them, but I do want to encourage you because you're partly integrating and validating their experience. So integrating is the most important part. You're not telling them their book is awesome if it isn't. You're just there to talk to them. And then you find out what they're really dealing with. So you might have made a suggestion, what if so-and-so does this? And they'll tell you, well, yeah, I thought about that, but it won't work because of this. And then you can brainstorm other possibilities. So if you like thinking on your feet or just talking to writers, even just being silent on those calls after the initial 5 minutes can be really, really helpful to them. And listening and asking questions. And I think where I'm going with that, with all of these, is to meet the writer on their map. Identifying the most workable solutions for a particular manuscript is not something you can learn to do at an expert level overnight. That is where developmental editing rewards experience and where an abiding interest in fiction is needed as you go through, to become a really good developmental editor. But just because you can't learn to do it at an expert level overnight does not mean you should wait to do a developmental edit. You should not wait. Can anybody think of why? Tagline for the course, because it's learned by doing. There's no way you can get to an expert level ever if you don't do one. So if the first one you're doing is in this course, that is just the start. When I first started editing, I knew more about the middle distance, scene dynamics, pacing. I didn't know about the cause and effect chain or the story engine or the power of concept, premise. I didn't know any of that stuff. Could I have given those early writers I worked with a better edit? Yes, probably. But I was also cheap, fairly quick, very thorough and generous in the manuscript markup. And I had a lot of suggestions and ideas. I've just always been super interested in story. And that's how I knew enough to be helpful. And that's how I got testimonials. So that's why I encourage you to start, regardless of how unprepared you might feel. And you can always work with novice writers. You'll always, even just taking this 1 6-week course, even if you had no other reading experience, you would know more than some editors. And I wish I was joking. And I don't mean to disrespect anybody. It's just that, there's no certification needed for this job. So you should, if you're interested, I would say don't wait. And absolutely, if you want to wait because you're working at a day job and, you'd rather do it slowly, poke your feet in the water gradually, that's absolutely fine too. In fact, I would say sometimes I feel that I am less useful now because I have a harder time remembering what novice writers don't know about yet. So I have a client in Ireland and we were doing a post-edit Zoom call about her revision. And it was a novella, speculative fiction. Her plan was to do full-length novella up for 7 books in this one series. She's self-publishing, and then I had written the one full novel that I had already edited was her first novel, and then the novella was sort of to sell it for Halloween because it was tied in with her marketing. So she knew when she sent me the story that they'd had issues and that they were structural. And if we're talking about structure in 3-act terms, when I read it, I thought the climax was too early. It happened at about the halfway mark, and the denouement and resolution were just way too long, and it was sort of felt like it was out of shape. But she had other things that she had to do. She needed to deliver some backstory from book 1 of the series and lay some groundwork for book 2. And because it was a novella, she had less canvas to work in. So in the editorial letter, I suggested reframing the story. I gave her specific suggestions on where to look, for expanding and cutting and moving to get the climax to later, to make it a different type of climax, because it couldn't be an action climax necessarily, but it could be an emotional climax. So making the character arc work harder. And then we were on the call and I was describing a bit more about how that might work. We were just kind of spitballing, and I mentioned doorway moments, which is another expression for turning points. And it wasn't until I saw her feverishly taking notes that I realized she didn't actually know about turning points. She hadn't studied dramatic structure, or, there's so many courses and stuff out there, but none of the courses she'd taken had actually talked about structure that much. And her first book didn't have a structural issue. So I didn't know she didn't know that. And had I known that she didn't know, I would have written a lot more about structure in the editorial letter for her novella. But it wasn't until we were on the call that I realized that she was unfamiliar with some of these concepts. And so we spent the next 15 minutes of that call talking about where the specific doorway moments or turning points were. I like doorway moments because it's when the character goes through a one-way door and they can't go back to where things were. That's why I like that term. So we just spent the rest of that call talking about where those were and how to heighten them and where to have them, where they could fit, because I knew the plot, she knew the plot. So it was kind of like a couple of mechanics talking about how to get a car to work. Okay, so that's where I'm going with this, is meeting the writer on their mat will look like whatever it looks like. Let's go back to the goals of developmental editing, not just improving that manuscript, but helping the writer be a better writer. So whatever solutions you propose, I encourage you to give the writer a learning experience as well. And you'll see when you get week 5's packet, I think it is, with 2 examples of editorial letters, that the second example, which I got off the internet, they're not easy to get because of confidentiality. You work on somebody's manuscript, it's in your contract, you're not going to share it with anybody. Anyway, I found this one. And there's no teaching in it. You know, it discusses the book, but it's not talking, there is no boilerplate text about what 3-act structure is or anything like that. Whereas mine initially, for sure, had a lot more teaching in them. Any questions? Okay. Zooming in for lesson 3. Active reading. Train. I don't know if I mentioned I'm big on trains. Yeah, Crystal. Well, metaphorically speaking, active reading is kind of like being on a train journey. So I don't know if anybody here loves trains like I do, but when I go on a new train trip, I'm participating deeply. So it's not like taking a commuter train that, you know, you've taken every day for the last 5 years. That's similar to your first read through a manuscript. It's a journey through a new landscape, one you've never been in before. You can see certain things out the window, and sometimes it might be a detailed close-up of a tree or the back of someone's house. At other times, you'll get a more panoramic view if the tracks go higher and you're not in the trees, but you can't see the train from the outside. And that's true of the manuscript as well. When you're on that first read, you'll get to know the things you can see while you're reading, like characterization, you know, how they come in, what do you feel like when they're on the page, that kind of stuff. You might even get flashes of insight about plot and structure, especially if you've read a lot of novels. If you have read a ton of novels, that'll be in your mind already. But the point is that this first phase of stage 1 of getting to know the novel the way it is, the act of active reading will be enough for you to be helpful in the big picture level, even if you never do a book map. So what is it? In week 1, I brought up reading sensibility, and it's not really about what you like in terms of your favorite types of novels, but about your own receptivity to the reading experience. Your full engagement with what you're reading will help you define what works and what doesn't work in a particular manuscript. So your sensibility, your ability to do that is your defining characteristic as a reader and as a developmental editor. It's your ability to interact with a text that lets you see inside its inner workings, and it can be developed. So how do you develop it? By focusing with your entire mind. This whole lesson is just about how to create that kind of bubble for yourself, which if you already know how to do that, this will be extraneous, but hopefully not completely boring. There's this long-running literary fiction magazine run by 2 sisters out of Portland, Oregon called Glimmer Train. If anybody writes short literary fiction, they also publish quite long stuff, like 15,000 words was the longest one I read there. It's one of the most incredible mags for short fiction, and they retired it in 2019. I went to their closing out party at a conference, AWP, if anybody's interested in writing conferences. And there I learned how they divided the work. One of them read everything that came in and made a short list for the next issue. And the one who read everything that came in said that she was aware in the back of her mind that she was always about 700 to 800 stories behind in the reading because of the number of submissions they got. But when she opened each story to read it, she had to forget about the wait list and give all her attention to that story. And that's what I do when I read a manuscript. I give it my full attention, and I make a record of where my attention is going by the marginal comments. So what are you looking for when you're active reading? You're not looking for anything. You're listening or receiving rather than broadcasting. You're noticing things. You're not even really noticing. You're noticing how the words are put together, because that's part of any reading experience, but you're noticing bigger things like how a character was introduced. I say that one a lot because it's something we can all relate to, you know, and the next novel you read, if you haven't already been noticing stuff like how characters are introduced, once you do, it's very interesting. Published novels, manuscripts can be different, obviously, because they haven't been edited, but so it's listening and responding via the comments, capturing the response. How do you do it? Well, when do you start, really? I start in the sample edit. And once I'm getting paid, I start as soon as possible after I receive the manuscript. First, you block your time. Then you prepare your manuscript and then you dive in. And once you're in there, my personal approach is to comment liberally. This 105-page novella that you're going to get to later tonight has had anywhere in this course has had anywhere from 18 to I think 479 marginal comments. Everybody's idea of liberal commenting is different, but there's no wrong way to do it. Just do whatever works for you. I like to comment liberally. 479 is not what I do, a couple hundred probably in something of this length, maybe 150 to 250, but don't try and, just do whatever feels natural. If it's only 60, that's fine if they're good comments. So I have a bit of obsession with keeping my work life as stress-free as possible. And to do that, I block my time. I set a deadline when I first get a manuscript. I set a deadline for finishing the first read because there's always other stuff to do. So that deadline is never going to be the day it's due. It's always going to be a couple of weeks before it's due, if possible. I start as soon as possible, partly because even if I'm running late and I don't start their manuscript for a few days, if it's corrupted or there's anything wrong with the file or they sent me an incomplete file, it's embarrassing if I don't know that till 2 weeks later and then I email them and say, oh, your file's incomplete. I check it immediately. So I start as soon as I can, even if I just read 10 pages and time how long that takes. I definitely log all the hours I spend reading. I keep a little, it's just a piece of lined paper. I handwrite on it when I start and when I end. And that way I can adjust my timing. So if it's taking me way longer to read than I thought it would, I work more hours that day on it. And if it's going quicker, I can either deliver the edit earlier, which has almost never happened, or I can have more time to write the letter. I've never missed a deadline except in 2016 when I got pneumonia. And other than that, I just don't miss them. I don't believe in it. It does happen. Life can go sideways. I also give a window of delivery, usually 1 week. So I have one that could be due tomorrow, but its last day I said I would send it is the 29th, which is Monday. So now I gotta hustle. I have read stories about or heard stories about editors who keep a manuscript for months. I'm not that person because I want the cash flow and also, not to sound predatory, I do like the cash flow, and also it's too stressful. It's too stressful for the writer and for me. So I do leave time for the other deliverables. Prepare the manuscript is pretty simple. If you work with manuscripts, I just save it and rename it. I just add my initials to the file name. So to show that unless their file name is 900 characters long, in which case I might abbreviate it a bit. I double space it and make the font readable for me. And I do that with track changes turned off because I don't want the mess in the margins. I always mark chapter headings as using styles. You can do it or not do it. It helps me jump around later when I'm doing the book map from chapter 1 to chapter 5, or if I want to check when something happened and I don't want to just scroll. If you're not familiar with how to mark chapter headings, just send me a DM and I'll post all the instructions in Slack because I have done that for this course regularly. So I set my comments to balloons just because I find the inline comments or whatever the other option is called slows my processing speed for some reason. So although I don't really love words, new comments where you have to hit enter every time or control enter, you do it. Okay. Oops, let me just back up. My file system is pretty simple. I have a file folder on my desktop called editing. And in that file folder, I have dozens of other folders nested inside it with the writer's name, because that's how I remember who's what. And then within each writer, I'll sometimes have 5 or 6 folders just for different novels we've worked on together, especially if they're self-publishing. And then in each of those novel folders, I'll have usually first pass and second pass. And sometimes LOA, letter of agreement, which is what I use instead of a contract, same thing. So that's how I do mine. As long as you know where to find stuff, that's all I would suggest. Okay, why am I so obsessed with timing? Because I think most editors track their time. I charge either by word or by project, sometimes both. I never charge by the hour unless I'm doing research for somebody or coaching them. And that's for the Zoom calls, I would charge by the hour. But I track all my time because it stops me from being delusional about how long the edit will take. If I know that the first 100 pages took me 6 hours to read, and there's 300 more to go, I know that I need to have 18 hours somewhere in my schedule before the first read deadline. So it's very helpful to, and now I know how long it's going to take me to do stuff, but every manuscript's different. Some reading speeds, some are faster than others, but I track my time for all of them. It's not hard. I just use, some people use Toggle or other things. I use paper. It so stops you from being delusional, and that makes you less likely to procrastinate. Procrastinate is a real thing. And when you don't procrastinate, it's a lot easier and less stressful to meet deadlines. Because I don't procrastinate for more than a day on most stuff, I never get to the point where I just want to change my name and go into witness protection. I've talked to editors who are so far behind that they can't imagine getting through their workload without pissing off a bunch of writers. And I don't want that in my life. It's too stressful. So, yeah. And I got in the habit of tracking my time early. When I was in university, I worked as a typist at a word processing center. This was before everybody had a laptop. NASA and the military had laptops. And so I got used to logging my time because our work was billed by the minute. So even if you went to the washroom in that job, you had to log your end when you stopped typing and when you started again. So I kind of have it. But this little timesheet just shows you, the green stuff is how long it takes me, say, to do the first read. And these all happen to be on the half hour of the hour. But if I start at 11:07, I'll write down 11:07. And I just try to keep it. I can only do max 90 minutes on any one task usually. Book map, say it took me 16 hours. Editorial letter, 9 hours sometimes. That's a whole bunch of processes that I do. It won't take you that long. And then I'll track everything. Did I go find them some resources like the first chapter of a book that's similar to show them how backstory was delivered from a previous book in the series? So I have a PDF library of resources that I send with edits sometimes. And so I'll explain a bit more about that. Proof, spell checks, send almost always on the day after I finish everything. I try not to send anything the day I finish it. And then a meeting. And so I work out my hourly rate, even if I'm getting paid by the project, which I always am, almost always. Okay, so we're going to finish this lesson just in the nick of time with because you're going to get the manuscript, what type of comments you might leave. I would say any type you like. Mine are usually observations, appreciation, if I'm loving it, or if I'm on the edge of my seat, I'll leave a comment. I'm on the edge of my seat. Observations, stuff like, that's a very old car for somebody so wealthy to drive. Simple questions, even silly ones like, who's Joseph? If I don't know who Joseph is, then that's a sign. Later I might go back because questions can be annoying. Some editors say don't leave questions in your manuscript comments, and that's fine. If I do leave a question, sometimes I'll go back and say, rephrase it as, consider reminding the reader who Joseph is by adding, her brother Joseph or something, just because if I don't know, who will. Raising issues depends, and if I find one, I'll definitely mention it if I see one. And making suggestions, same thing. Those ones might not stay in the manuscript, but that's where I keep everything. Any questions? How are we doing for time? 2 minutes. Key takeaways. Week 2. Oh, yeah, just to go back, I don't have a numerical aim when I comment, and you don't need to either. Okay, every developmental edit has a context. before you start, find out what the writer wants and needs. Some people use a questionnaire for that. Susanna does. It'll be in one of your packets, Noel Editorials Intake Questionnaire. There's all kinds of ways of talking to writers. I go back and forth by email, but my emails are pretty much the same all the time, just slightly tweaked. There's certain things I want to know. Define and articulate your scope of work. Before you sign a contract, make sure that you both know what you're going to be doing. That will save you tons and tons of hassles, and it will also let you see red flags. Because if somebody doesn't want to read the contract, I don't work unless I know they've read the contract and they've said they've read it and they accept it. I just don't do it. I've had too many bad experiences. They always end up okay, but it's been a pain in the ass for me. So I define and articulate my scope of work all the way through the intake process. Then this is really just encouragement to take the edit step by step. Insights and confidence come from doing the steps and using the tools. So trust the process. Step one, which is really what we just talked about, requires time and focus. To give yourself this time, plan ahead. So I know it's a long weekend coming up for the States, I think, Memorial Day. Is that an American thing? Yeah. So, you might have plans next weekend, in which case I would say try and slot in 3 or 4 hours to spend with the manuscript outside of your weekend. And that just means looking at your schedule. I don't want to sound, I'm not being at all like didactic about this. It's just save my bacon. So we will do the steps as I do them, and you'll see just how magical it is. It's not a cookie cutter approach at all. It's about giving yourself and the writer a strong enough container to let you both see the novel as clearly as you can. And that's fun. Okay. Assignments. This is a hard deadline. 9 a.m. Pacific, June 5th. We'll meet again before that. That one, there's no wiggle room because I need them all before I even start. So I come into work, everything that I've gotten by 9, I'll download and I'll start my process. So sending it to me at noon is not going to be, it's not going to be on time. Good practice. Assigned reading, there's some in the packet, but the priority is really reading the novella. If you want practice writing analysis of other people's fiction, I suggest writing a reading commentary. This was an assignment I got in my MFA program. Very, very helpful. And I gave quite a, I don't know, detailed description in the packet. But if you do decide to write one, it might also help you prep for the editorial letter, which we do write in less than a week. So it's a kind of a grind. If you do want to write one, you can send it to me. I won't give you feedback, but I'll read it. And so that can be interesting for me. Bring questions to Slack or next week's class. Week 3. So my train metaphor. We're going to talk about craft elements from the train window. That might be the second lesson. I move them around. More on active reading and how to stay big picture if you're used to editing at the word level. And we're going to start looking at how to do a book map. Any final questions?
I
Crystal?
was wondering if I could hold you after to ask you a couple questions.
Of course. And anybody who wants to stay is welcome to stay. If you got to go, I totally get it. And you can just fast forward to this wrap up Q&A slide on the replay. I'm excited. Hit me.
So I actually last year contracted with the dev editor, and I told her up front, I was like, hey, first time novel, hit me. Like, I know this needs a ton of work. And she was like, of course, of course. So we contracted for $1,000 for her to do 2 rounds of dev editing and 1 proofreading. And she gave me 4 comments.
Oh my God.
And I was like, I was kind of hoping for a little bit more than that, and I kind of prodded her on a couple things and asked for more explicit feedback on certain things. And she was like, no, it's totally fine, this and that. And I was like, I know I'm not that good of a writer. There's only 4 things I need to improve on this. So she either didn't take it seriously or yeah. So I was going to ask you, as someone who's been doing this for a while, I did sign a contract, but at this point, I don't feel like I'm getting my money's worth. So what's the appropriate way to kind of end that relationship in a clean way so that it's not like just lingering out there forever. Like,
Yeah.
I signed this contract I never filled.
Yeah. You mean from the writers, from your point of view,
Yeah,
like how to
yeah.
end it? Yeah. Geez, that's a tough one. So you've asked her for more and she's basically said, that's all I got.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's one of those chalk it up to experience things. And if she hasn't given you more, and it was last year, you're unlikely to get any more from her. Let me think. Now that is a bad experience. It's hard with editors because you don't know much about them. Did she do a sample edit?
Well, I was referred to her by another friend who's a ghostwriter, and so she had done some editing for that. But yeah, and she's pretty well established, so I was really surprised that that's what I got back.
It's
Yeah.
amazing.
So
Yeah.
I mean, like you said it earlier too, there's plenty of people out there who are not really qualified and they somehow still make a living. So
Absolutely. And so from what you can do, I would say very little. And I would just say thanks for all your help, or thanks for your time and move on. You paid her? Is the payment
well, I
complete?
paid her the first half. That's where it's kind of sticky.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see. So you got some leverage. And she doesn't, she thinks she should get the second half without doing any more stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not doing more stuff. She's obviously open to reading it a second time and giving more feedback. But with the feedback I got the first time around, I'm just not interested in spending another $500 to be told 4 bullet points worth of feedback.
Yeah. Can you walk away with just having paid the first half?
Well, that's what I was curious, and you may not know, this may be too legal, but yeah.
Do you have a contract with her, or
Yeah.
So does it say you can walk away after the first pass?
I'll have to double check.
Yeah, my contracts say either party can quit the arrangement at any point, and I will return all unedited materials immediately and refund any time I haven't spent. And from the writer's perspective, if I'm ahead on the work and they're behind on the payment, they'll just pay me anything they owe me. But I've never enacted that clause, and no writer ever has, because I always finish what I contracted for in an acceptable manner. 4 comments. I'm appalled. That is shocking to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm appalled. It's some editors do not actually know what developmental editing is. And it's a shame that they're offering it to writers, because it can be very confusing to writers when they go, like my friend Larry. So he went to get the battle scenes sorted out, and he felt like it was a copy edit, a copy edit light, it wasn't even a copy edit. So it can be incredibly disappointing when your expectations aren't met. I will say 2 rounds and a proofread for $1,000 is not overcharging if she did the work, but it is overcharging for what sounds like a beta read.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get
Yeah.
an editorial letter?
No.
Oh, leap.
No,
What?
and there was no phone call after to discuss. Like, we had an introductory, here's the project, here's, she's like, here's what I can do. And I was like, great. And I was like,
Wow.
well, you said that you're gonna do this and that. What if, how was that for my story? And she was like, it was fine.
Oh my God. Ugh, brutal.
Yeah, and that's
a
really
tough
what
one.
kind of got me prompted and started on the whole dev editing journey for myself, just doing it first, because there's so many people, and that came from a person that I trusted, and I was like
Yeah.
really surprised. So I was like, yeah, if that's not going to cut it, then I better just do it myself.
Yeah, that's smart. I mean, Crystal, I just feel terrible about that, not because it shouldn't have happened, it's and I would say if you can just cut it off and say, since I don't want to proceed, I'm happy to stop here, or whatever, might want to phrase it a bit stronger than that. And then if she says, she probably won't come back for more money unless I read a horror story recently on Facebook about an editor who doesn't deliver and then gets like medieval on people, threatening and stuff. So if you get that kind of vibe, I wouldn't know what to suggest, but I think she would probably walk away from it. And if she really has no clue that she hasn't fulfilled the first half of the scope of work, then I would just tell her, as politely as possible. I don't feel that you fulfilled the first half of the scope of work. If she asks for more money, if you're
Yeah.
okay with walking away from the 500 for a manuscript with 4 comments, that's appalling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it was a 60,000 word manuscript. It was like a complete, yeah. And and I've done tons of rehauling on it over this last year. So I've already seen, you know, like where there was room for improvement, and I've done so.
Right.
But just the fact that that wasn't even like brought up to me at all. And it was stuff too where it was like, you can't use lyrics, you can't like directly quote lyrics. So it wasn't even about like the story. It was like,
Yeah.
oh, there's a lot of like head hopping in here. And there were like
God.
2 instances. And I was like, there's got to be more than that.
Yeah. So her area of expertise was not actually developmental editing.
It sounds like not so much.
Yeah, it shouldn't have been offered as a service from her. And also, is she avoiding your emails?
No, she's actually reached out and she's been like, you got to finish this thing. You better, you know, send me the next copy so that we can, you know, finish this contract. And I'm like, no.
Yeah. I would say I would just, my advice is sounding like it's all over the place. I was like, if you can walk away, great. But now I would say if you can stop the contract after the first pass and just tell her that's what you want to do. And you might not want to get into why you want to do it unless she says no. And then you could come back with another email saying, well, actually, I don't want to engage in the second pass because you haven't fulfilled the scope of work for the first pass, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no point.
Yeah. Well, that was the first question.
Okay, exciting.
Slide to the side. Second question, I know you said that you're kind of just getting into the coaching side of things.
Mhm.
And I'm like, bear in mind, I'm years and years away from this. I'm just now getting started with the dev editing piece of it. But I was curious if you would be open to having me just kind of be a fly on the wall for some of your discussions, just so I can kind of see you at work and what that looks like.
Woo!
Could take some meeting notes, maybe be a sounding board if there's stuff you want to run by, or, you know, as you're being focused working with other people, maybe there's things I pick up on where you're like, can ask about that later, or I don't know, just
Wow.
something to run by you.
That's a cool ask, and nobody has ever suggested that before. I'll tell you, it's quite an intimate relationship between writer and editor. It would create work for me because you'd have to read their manuscript too. And so I can't really think of a situation where a threesome would be better than a twosome. But I will think on that. I will think on if there's a way to do that, because I also work with writers who, aren't paying for it because I do some volunteer work and stuff. And so even if, let me think about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it might take the whole course for me to think about it because I really got to think about it.
Yeah, no rush, no worries.
Yeah.
I just wanted to plant the seed.
Yeah, no, and it's because the way you learn how to coach is you can take an expensive coaching class or a cheap coaching class. It doesn't really matter. There's this, Jenny Nash has Author Accelerator. You can be a certified coach. I've heard good things about her program. It used to be $1,400. I'm not sure what it is now, but because I've been doing the call for years, I have been doing a form of coaching for years with writers. And so now I sell it as a standalone, but I rarely do it because my interest is the whole manuscript. So it's almost always an addition. It'll be something we do together after I do an edit. And then if they're querying, I'll sometimes coach them through the query process, or even, like work on it with them. I don't like to write their query letters, but I will do other stuff. So yeah, interesting. I'm happy to talk about coaching more too. So the where you can develop a coaching kind of package or strategy. I'll look for some people I know who do it and put their websites up so you can see
Okay. Yeah, that'd be
how
awesome.
they do it. Yeah.
Very cool.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Those are tough. Crystal, you're not messing around here.
No.
That's good. That's good. We're here to learn.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question or situation? Okay. Namaste. Thank you all for staying late, and you'll get your stuff later. Okay. See you next week.